the infliction of violence on other people profoundly changes people. And even the preparation and the psychological conditioning that it takes to prepare normal young people to do those terrible things has profound impacts on them, even if they don't ever do them.
Welcome back to Sanctuary in the Jungle. I'm your host, Aaron Nelson. Often when I talk about building a sanctuary for my clients, I'm usually doing it one client at a time, helping individuals case by case. Today's guest has spent his career thinking broader by working to change the system itself. Brock Hunter is a criminal defense attorney just across the river in Minnesota, a veteran and the founder of the Veterans Defense Project. In 2008, he helped pass a veteran sentencing statute in Minnesota. When it was cited in the Supreme Court, other states started paying attention. Brock found himself traveling the country, helping introduce similar legislation in other states, and eventually returning to update the Minnesota statute where it all began. This legislation helps give veterans a pathway to treatment, even when their jurisdiction doesn't have a veterans court. But before we get into any of that, we start at the beginning, discussing how military service and violence can profoundly change people in the way they participate in society. When we understand this, we start to see public safety differently and rethink how we, as a community, should create it. I hope you enjoy. Here's Brock. Welcome, Brock.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit, just to get everybody to know you, tell us a little bit about what you do and where you're at right now.
Sure. I'm a criminal defense lawyer based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. We practice all types of criminal defense, but focus on more serious crimes and have a focus on defending veterans in the criminal courts. And I've been doing that for about 27 years now.
Wow. Yeah. And I know you've, like you said, you have a breadth of experience in all kinds of things, but we really want to get into some of the stuff with defending veterans. You've literally wrote the book on it, is that right?
One of, yes.
You're the editor, at least, of the book over here, Veterans Defense Project's Attorney's Guide to Defending Veterans in Criminal Court. You and your partner, is that right?
My partner, Ryan Else, and I, co-edited that book, yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about the journey on how you maybe got to that book and got to be the one of the national experts, if not the national expert on it. And so you're a Midwesterner. You grew up in the Midwest. Where were you born?
I was born and raised in Rapid City, South Dakota, and graduated high school there, and went into the military straight out of high school, and did a 4-year stint in the Army, and got out. I went to college, undergraduate in South Dakota, and then moved to Minnesota to go to law school at the University of Minnesota, and have been around Minnesota ever since. Yeah. Well,
let's dive into some of that. You kind of had a change there in your teen years in your high school. Is that right?
Yeah. I was one of those kids in middle school who I was getting good scores on standardized tests, but my grades were not reflecting that. I was not fulfilling my potential, and my parents put me into a private Catholic school that was much more academically rigorous, and that was a very, I think, beneficial thing for me at that time. And so I was in this very much more academically strenuous environment, and all of my peers were heading off to college, and I guess I kind of assumed I would be as well. And one day, my summer before my senior year of high school, my dad called me into his office and asked me if I'd thought how I was going to pay for college. And this was not a topic of conversation I had been having with my friends, and I had vaguely assumed I would be going to college, but it wasn't something I was giving a lot of thought to. And he explained that, and as I knew at the time, my family was going through some financial difficulties, so they were not in a position to pay for college. And he slid a big envelope across the desk to me that was a bunch of information about the Army GI Bill and college fund, which was a shock to my system, to say the least. And I didn't know what to make of it, and staggered out of his office and sat down and started looking through the stuff, and relatively quickly got kind of excited about it. I think
Oh, yeah.
he I think saw in me that I would benefit from doing something in life for a little bit before and maturing a bit before going to college, and thought this would be a good thing to do.
Was there any history in your family of service to the armed forces?
My dad was in ROTC in college and was proud of the fact that he had more demerits than anyone in the program, and did not do well. So no, there was really no distinguished military history in my family to speak of.
He wondered why you needed some structure coming out of middle school.
No, I think, he probably saw that I had similar issues to what he probably had.
Up till that point, were you pretty active? Were you playing sports in the band?
Yeah.
What were you?
I was definitely pretty active, and growing up as a kid in the we lived right on the edge of Rapid City, on the edge of the Black Hills National Forest, and I grew up running around in the woods, and it was very outdoorsy in that way, and so that's kind of what I think resonated about going into the military for me, was that it was going to be a big adventure.
Sure. I mean, you're going to high school in the 80s.
Right.
You're watching First Blood and whatever other movies are out there about the Cold War and American.
Red Dawn was a very formative movie as a kid, because it was kind of set in that Western, and my friends and I were running around with our BB guns in the woods playing
Shouting
Red Dawn.
Wolverines.
Absolutely. So, and it's interesting, in one of your earlier podcasts, you were talking about Star Wars and it being sort of a modern form of mythology, and that resonates with me because as a kid I was right in the heart of the first Star Wars trilogy target market, right? And I never really put it together until years after the military, but I went to there was an exhibition at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts probably 15 or 20 years ago that was a Star Wars exhibition of Star Wars as this modern mythology, and looking at it from this more high-minded standpoint, and how mythology has always played this role in society of mobilizing the masses towards these hero journey stories to go off and fight wars and stuff like that, right? And that Luke Skywalker was the classic mythological protagonist. And
he's a kid on a farm.
As I went through that exhibit, I just thought to myself, they got me. I going into the military, I consciously or not was in my mind Luke Skywalker getting out of this backwater, place off to go become a Jedi and have big adventures.
Sure.
Very naive perspective, as I soon found out, but it definitely had an impact on my perceptions of that.
So you're back there on the couch, reading through this stuff. Take us through that a little bit, because that's again, maybe there's some naive thoughts that 17-year-old, 16-year-old boys just think of then, right? But it sounds like it's very different from the people that you were hanging out with. Nobody else had thought about the military?
No, it was not. It was not at all front and center in my mind and my perspective at that time. And I had friends, we were all taking the ACTs and all of that stuff, and everybody was looking at going to college. And I felt, I felt a lot of trauma around that initially, that I wasn't going to be going with them and going into that next stage of life like they were, and dread about that. But as I'm going through this military-related literature, there's all of these, recruiting propaganda, for lack of a better term, with guys with green painted faces wading through chest-deep water, in jungles and stuff. And then all of a sudden, all of my, all the movies I had grown up with and all of this stuff started to impact. And I was just like, oh, this is my chance to go be a Jedi, And so I remember it was like an endorphin rush hit me as I was sitting there going through this, and I started to become very, very excited about this whole idea. And in a way, my parents did not anticipate.
Yeah. So how does that evolve over that course of your senior year? You've accepted this, right?
Yeah.
But you've got this group of friends whose going in that direction, and you've clearly decided, maybe it's put upon you and you've accepted it, but you're taking a different path than them. I'm guessing that's hard to live through the next 6 months until you're on that path.
Yeah. So this conversation again, it happened the summer before my senior year that this started, and I actually went to the military recruiter and signed up on the delayed enlistment program. So I signed on the dotted line before my senior year even started. And that trip off to the recruiter to formally engage in this process was very interesting, in that I went and sat down and really had no sense, other than going into the military, that was the thing, and to get the college fund. And they were going through all these various jobs, and I had done pretty well on the aptitude test, the military aptitude test. And so there's basically any job, and they were showing me a lot of more technical jobs. And I just wasn't feeling it. I was just like, I know. Computer stuff, no, not really. Linguists, no, not really. And then going down this list, and they had all these occupations that were available at the time that they needed people in, and certain amounts of college benefits attached and all of this stuff. And cavalry scout was there, and that jumped off the page. It didn't look like any of the other stuff. It just was like, boom. And I was like, what is that? And the guy's like, oh, well, that's, you gather intelligence. You go behind enemy lines and gather intelligence for the commander, the eyes and ears of the army. And I was like, that sounds interesting. And they had a little cassette, like video cassette thing for that job, and they plugged it in, classic 80s technology. And I watched what was probably a 3 or 4 minute video commercial for being a cavalry scout. And that was it. I was just like, I can get the college fund for this. Yes, you can. But you'd have to do an additional amount of time in, because I'd been thinking 2 or 3 years enlistment. And suddenly I was like, okay, signed up. And I was so excited. And I come home, and my parents are like, so everything went well? And I was like, oh, yeah. And what did you going to do? And I said, I'm going to be a cavalry scout. And I explained what that meant. And my mom looked at my dad like, great idea, Dave. Yeah. Maybe not at all what they had in mind at all. But by then it was too late. I had already signed up, and that's what I was going to be. So I went through my senior year of high school already knowing exactly what I was going to be doing, and it was kind of surreal, but I was excited. Yeah. By that time, I was committed to this path. And
was it? Were you somebody that was a risk taker, an adventurer?
Yeah.
Up till that point, I mean, I know you said you were running around, but this is in line with who Brock Hunter is at that age.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It wasn't that hard to predict, actually.
Sure.
That this was what I would probably end up doing, and given that choice. But
maybe we'll get into it a little bit more as we move on about how those of us in America think about the Army, the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, the services, when we don't know anything about it, right? And it sounds like maybe your loving, supportive, wonderful mother had a different perception.
Oh, yeah. No, she saw me doing some kind of desk job in the rear with the gear sort of kind of thing. Yeah, absolutely. And
That's not how it played out. So
I'm sure they had some private conversations about this whole plan my dad had hatched that I wasn't privy to. But
and so you're in the Army for 4 years as it's in the 90s?
Late 80s. So I graduated from high school in 1987, and I went off to basic training 2 weeks later.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Really, the crux of my service was I got orders to deploy to Korea, and this would have been in 89.
Bring us back to 89. What's going on in 89?
1989 was the crescendo of the Cold War, as it turned out, and I arrived there right in early, like January of 89, I guess. And once again, kind of got to a juncture where I arrived at the Army's 2nd Infantry Division headquarters at Camp Casey, and we're talking division is like 20-some thousand U.S. troops that are the main combat force on the DMZ in Korea, and found myself in one of the more high-speed units in the division, right up on the edge of the DMZ, and our mission was to be the eyes and ears for the division commander and a quick reaction force for the division. And
you one of those guys on the wall?
Yeah, I mean, well, and over the wall. The
Okay.
DMZ isn't a solid border; it's a zone.
Okay.
And we actually did live missions into the no man's land zone between the fences, where I came to learn a lot of stuff was happening that wasn't really talked about publicly. There's, as we used to say, there is no D in the DMZ. It's a very heavily militarized border, and at that time very active, with the North Koreans sending infiltrators across on a regular basis and a lot of stuff going on. And that year in particular was very busy because the Cold War was coming to this head. And in June of
I was going to say there was
June of that year, the Tiananmen Square massacre happened
Okay.
in Beijing, about 300 miles to the west of us, and that summer became very turbulent time in the communist bloc, with revolutions happening all over the place, and the Berlin Wall fell that fall. And during that summer, the North Koreans massed pretty much their entire military force on the DMZ, about 1.6 million troops, and were very much poised to invade, with the idea that if they could just cross the border and take Seoul, the biggest city in South Korea is just 25 miles south of the border, so very close, and a city larger than New York City.
Wow.
And really the crown jewel of the whole of South Korea. And so the North Koreans' plan was always to come down and try to take Seoul, and this was going to be their time to do it if they were ever going to do it, because their sponsor states were in crisis and crumbling. And so that summer was very, very tense, and we were constantly being alerted. And
these alerts were, not like be ready, but there was some messages in those alerts that sounds like were life-changing.
Yeah. I mean, our motto in the second ID was ready to fight tonight, every day. And so no one was got off duty unless every weapon was cleaned and ready to go, every system up and running, batteries topped off, everything ready to go at a moment's notice. And we would get these alert sirens that would blow, and we were, had minutes to be heading to certain locations and loading up in vehicles or helicopters. And
the Army obviously had an incentive to, not that it wasn't real, but to make it as real for you and your
Yep.
other soldiers as possible. Like,
we were never told these were, practice alerts ever. It was always the real thing as far as we knew. And it was pretty well known within the second ID that with the North Koreans outnumbering us, 20 to 1, 1.6 million troops against our 20,000, and the South Koreans had about 200,000 active forces. We were just vastly outnumbered, and it was pretty conventional wisdom that our whole division was to be sacrificed, essentially. We were not expected to make it more than about 72 hours before we would have 100% casualties.
So how long are you, so you're on this alert where they're like, at any moment this alarm can go off and you've got 72 hours to live?
Or less. With us being the division reconnaissance, we were sort of expected to maybe make it the first 24 hours.
How long are you in this, I don't know what you would even call it, panic state, crisis state?
It varied from time to time. I mean, sometimes within a couple hours they would index the alert, as they call it, and call it off, and we would go back to bed, supposedly. But sometimes it went on for a day or more, and we would deploy further out to our strategic points and stuff, still thinking that this is all real.
But even then, you'd wake up the next day and it could start all over again.
Right. So and our commanders, and this is nothing new to us. This is, I think, something that has been talked about in militaries for ages, and still to this day, that the advice of commanders to the troops is to accept your own death. that to be fully functional in combat and as fearless as possible and as effective as possible, you need to go into accepting your own death, accepting you're not going to survive this, or you'll be preoccupied with staying alive.
And they're telling this to 18, 19, 20-year-old young men.
Right. Yeah.
How does one, again, how does one get to that? I mean, is it just they say it, you do it? Is it as simple as that? How do you get to that mindset? I mean, just thinking here as a privileged 55-year-old guy who's never had to confront something like that, that's a remarkable mindset.
I wouldn't say it's something as much that you actively did as much as it just kind of happens, especially after multiple alerts and each time kind of looking around at your friends and being like, well, this could be our last day together, and it just kind of sinks in, and it had an impact. And as in the years since, when I've done a lot of research on the effects of military trauma and everything, we jokingly at the time saw these impacts on ourselves, and we coined the term pre-traumatic stress disorder, which actually is very accurate and something that psychological researchers have coined in reference to troops who are on this tripwire in various contexts, who are on the edge of combat a lot, start to have impacts from it. And it was definitely apparent in ours.
Man. Yeah. How long, I mean, that stretch, again, I know it was day to day. Is this a summer, 90 days, 180 days?
I mean, the entire time I was there, it was definitely very tense. But looking back on it, the most tense time was that period in the summer and fall of '89. I was there all the way through into midway through 1990.
Okay.
And it was still tense when I left. But looking back on it, that first summer I was there was the most stressful point. And got out and came home, and within weeks of living in that environment, I was starting as a freshman in college in South Dakota.
So I mean, you're in high school, 2 weeks, boom, you're in the military, 4 years, and then 2 weeks after that, you're back into a college environment. That's some whiplash, I imagine.
Yeah, it was, and it was there in that period that I think really planted the seeds for the work I ended up doing in the criminal courts with veterans, because my transition back to that civilian existence was not smooth and seamless. I was very amped up and bored.
Sure.
And one of my combat veteran clients in more recent years defined his experiences coming back from real war to civilian life, as he says, it was like living in 1080p high definition and coming back to grainy black and white.
Yeah.
And that's, I thought, was a pretty good analogy. And so came back and
these are real. I mean, I know we'll get, but that's like, there's some real chemicals that are impacting your body as a result of this. That's not just a matter of will or just acceptance.
Yeah. So I found, shockingly quickly, two other veterans who had just gotten out of the military themselves, who had been in similar. One was a Marine, the other was in the 82nd Airborne Division, and were experiencing similar adjustment issues. And we, along with some other folks that we were in school with, fell into a group, and we were wild children for a while. Drinking on Olympic levels and doing just stupid stuff that could have got us into immense amounts of trouble.
Yeah, but they're but the grace of God, right? And you eventually found your way to law school.
Yeah. So the first couple of years was rough. I did really well in class. Looking back on it, the military experience was very helpful in maturing me and instilling self-discipline, and I think I had an insecurity complex about coming back to school. I thought that being out of school for a few years was going to somehow prevent me from performing in that environment. And so I was very diligent about my studies. In fact, my freshman year, I outlined every single reading assignment I had. I didn't even know outlining was a thing then, like it would become in law school, but I just was like, how can I ensure I know every single thing
overachieving?
Yeah, and I worked hard, but played hard and did, like I said, a lot of stupid stuff in my off time, but got good grades and found my way into various activities in school and things to channel my energy that were productive. And one of them was debate, and got pretty into college debate. And in that environment, rubbed shoulders with a lot of other folks who had law school in their sights, and that made sense to me.
All right. You're good at school. I'm an intellectual. I like ideas.
Yeah, I like
Let's keep doing
debating,
this.
and it was the thing that resonated with me probably the most of my time in undergrad. And so, yeah, I decided to go to law, and I wasn't ready to go back out into the real world yet, for sure. And staying in academics for a longer didn't have any qualms about doing that. So, yeah, I ended up applying to various law schools and ended up at the University of Minnesota.
So you're in law school.
Yeah.
Do you still have some of your veteran friends there? Have you found and gravitated to them in that world?
Always, wherever I go, I always find the fellow veterans. Yeah.
How does that happen?
Well, law school is very cloistered, so you get to know everybody pretty well and pretty quickly. It's your whole entire life. And in my experience, it wasn't the connection in that time frame. It wasn't somebody who had been in the military. The University of Minnesota, I wouldn't say law school was not full of military vets, but one of my classmates had just come out of the CIA, had been a CIA field officer, Jack Rice, who is still a close friend and colleague of mine today, and who played a critical role in me ending up doing criminal defense, actually. But once we found each other, we both saw the world in similar ways and had similar experiences far outside of the norm. And
were you a little older in your class too?
I was going to say, we both felt like kind of old men compared to a lot of our classmates that had just come straight through high school, college, and law school.
That was the journey I took, is just boom, 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 19 years of school in a row.
Yeah. So he and I became very close over the course of law school, and interestingly, both of us really didn't know what we wanted to do when we grew up as lawyers, and the U of M, I think, at least in that time frame, was very effective at convincing law students that going off to big firm law world was the pinnacle thing to do.
Sure.
And
that's kind of what law school is about. I mean, if you really think about it, law schools are like, I don't think University of Minnesota is special on that. They're pushing lawyers to go into big law.
And I was susceptible to that argument from the military. Had I not gotten out of the military, what I had aspired to do if I was going to stay in was to go into the Special Forces, the Green Berets, and in fact took some steps in that direction. Some of my friends that I served with as scouts did go in that direction and became Green Berets. And I always harbored some level of doubt about not going that route, and that maybe that was what I should have done, kind of thing. And so when I got to law school and learned that there was this sort of what was presented as sort of a more pinnacle thing to do, I was like, well, that's what I'll focus on doing. And so I did. I went that route and ended up getting a job at a large corporate firm in Minneapolis, and so did my friend Jack. How'd
that feel?
It was terrible.
I figured that was going to be your answer.
It was just utterly horrible, and both of us were miserable, like really from the very beginning.
And just for those who maybe don't know big law or don't know why was it terrible? What was miserable about it? What do first year lawyers in big firms end up doing? Or at least what did you?
Nothing important or meaningful.
Yeah.
I spent my third year interning at the same firm, so I had an intern experience. It wasn't bad.
Sure.
But once I got out and got into it as a junior associate, I was in an employment litigation group, so we were doing employer side employment defense work. And the partner I worked for, his specialty was sexual harassment defense.
So you're working for the man who's working for the man.
We're working for the man who's working for the man that's sexually harassing, in their workplace. And I just was not finding a lot of sense of purpose and meaning in that mission, to say the least. And my existence basically was drafting summary judgment motions in these kinds of cases, and other assorted stuff too. But that was a big part of what we were doing, and it just didn't speak to me.
Sure.
And I would say, in a larger sense, I just came to realize that environment was not a place that I was going to find a home, even if I was in a different practice area.
Yeah.
I didn't see a lot of very fulfilled, self-actualized people in that environment.
Is that something you think you were conscious of and searching for meaning at that stage in your life, that age in your life?
No doubt. And one of the benefits of the military, and there were a lot of downsides to my experience as well, but one of the big benefits was having a sense of purpose and mission and meaning, and being part of something bigger than myself, and missing it when I didn't have it subsequently.
Yeah.
And it's something I see in a lot of our veteran clients that we've worked with over the years, who come home from their military service often having experienced far more trauma and stuff than I did, and who are struggling to reintegrate back in the civilian world. And part of it is untreated trauma, but as I found very often, the other part of it is that lack of sense of purpose and mission and meaning in life.
And that's something we as criminal defense attorneys share with them.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, when I speak to criminal defense attorney groups about representing veterans, I often note that, though I would say that veterans are not, or there are not a ton of veterans in the criminal defense community. Most of us, come from more lefty sort of perspectives and are not as likely to have served in the military. But I'm always careful to point out that, in my experience within the legal realm, the criminal defense community, and particularly the public defender part of the criminal defense community, are the closest analog subculture of the law to combat soldiers, combat veterans, in that they're warrior cultures that are very insular and really kind of separated countercultures from the rest of the mainstream world, and are doing very often hard, gritty, but very important things that are defending, our Constitution and our system that makes our country unique.
Yeah, defending principles
With
different tools, perhaps than the military, but in many ways
very similar.
Same thing.
And the warrior culture, that warrior ethos, that esprit de corps, that camaraderie.
Yeah. One of the things I've heard you talk about is just the commonality that our mission is misunderstood by the public.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? That us as criminal defense attorneys, that I think the public often doesn't understand what we do or why we do it.
That's right.
Right? And it's got to be the same in the military, especially for people now. Like, how could you go over there and have a gun? How could you have done this harm or done this violence or done whatever it is, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So
what are the questions? I mean, just following that theme for a second, Brock, I mean, we all, I know the question that people ask us in criminal defense world because they misunderstand it, right? It's how can you defend that person? Yep. We don't need to get into that. Yep. But is there a similar question that you find people are asking veterans along the same moral?
Absolutely. Yeah. How could you go over there and do violence to people? And how can you center your whole life and your job around the application of violence? It is so outside of the norm of anything that exists in the civilian world. It really is its own very distinct subculture. And even within the military, there are very distinct subcultures. And the combat arms is a relatively small part of the military. 20% or less of the Army are actual combat soldiers whose job is to go out and do that mission, and everybody else are in various levels of support of that mission.
In many ways, like criminal defense attorneys, there's many criminal defense attorneys, and lots of us do work in a different way. But the front lines, defending the violence, that's a smaller percentage of us.
Very much, yeah. And so even within the military, there's this counterculture, that the combat troops feel very much other than the rest. And that very much resonates within my experience of being within the criminal defense community.
Yeah. Are there times, again, in your experience now as a criminal defense attorney, talking to the veterans, is that something that they share, that they're just like how we share? If I have to answer that goddamn question one more time, it just, you get dismissive answers or you have walk away answers. Is it the same for the military vet, that they'll have a pocket answer that'll just make somebody go away?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yeah. Veterans coming back from their service, particularly from war service, get a lot of questions that are maybe well-intentioned or uninformed, but are kind of offensive. How many people did you kill, and stuff like that that are hard to answer. And
there's no good answer.
There's no good answer, and are part of the divide that exists between returning veterans and their communities that they just fought to serve.
It just separates them even more so, right?
Right.
I mean, it's almost a poor analogy perhaps for me to say in any ways that I feel the same, but it feels like it's like you don't belong. The reason they're asking this question is you don't belong here. Justify your existence. Tell me why you should be at this party, you should be at this dinner table, you should be in this community.
And or you are like this alien specimen that we don't know what to do with, and we're interested in poking and prodding it and trying to figure it out a little bit for just for curiosity's sake. You're objectified because you're otherized. You're not a real person here, and let me just So you're in this unfulfilling, unmeaningful job, and I heard a story about you going up north in wonderful northern Wisconsin and on a kayak trip, and you maybe got diverted. Tell me about that. Well, so that was a little bit further, and I'll get to that. That was a pivotal moment in my life. But so here's Jack and I both working at this large firm in downtown Minneapolis, miserable beyond belief, trying to figure out what we were going to do. And he was the first to jump. He had an opportunity come up, and I don't know how it came, but a job, a temporary job as a contract prosecutor in Scott County, Minnesota, and very quickly was reporting back, this is fun, and I remember getting together with him and him saying, this is it. I don't want to do prosecution, but when this contract's up, I think I'm just going to hang out a shingle and do criminal defense work. And I was like, wow, that's a really bold. Okay. And,
you got to. I mean, your job is not maybe meaningful and fulfilling, but it's a guaranteed paycheck.
It's a paycheck, right? Yeah, and I'm like, and how are you going to make a living doing this again? And but I was so miserable at that point that I was just getting ready to quit law altogether. And Jack's message was, well, if you're ready to just quit altogether, what do you have to lose? And I was like, point. So I left the firm and hung out a shingle and got a part-time public defender gig and started that whole journey. I had, in this context, squandered my law school time. I had taken criminal law and criminal procedure, but I had not done clinics. I hadn't done anything to really prepare for this. And so there was a lot of catch-up to do and a lot of faking it till you make it type of situation.
But you're behind the scenes at the big firm. You're not having direct contact with any clients. It's all this abstract, producing papers. And now all of a sudden a human being comes in your office and says, help me.
Yep.
How did you become a helper?
I quickly found that just felt right. And in this regard, I also came to realize my time in the military as a low-ranking enlisted man in a combat unit had prepared me for this well, because I had spent those years bonding deeply with people from all walks of life, all races, ethnic backgrounds, geographical, socioeconomic, and I knew what their worlds looked like. My unit, I had African Americans from South Central LA and Detroit, and rural white guys from the South who had been involved in the KKK and everything in between, and had not just been exposed to them, but had gotten to know them all very, very deeply, and so a guy named Mark Hull became one of my closest friends in the Army, and Mark grew up in South Central Los Angeles in the late 80s at the height of the violence and the Crips and the Bloods and that whole world. And he and I were roommates in the Army and got to be extremely close. And I think both of us got very deep educations from each other. He had very little interaction with white people, especially people from South Dakota, which he couldn't even conceive of what South Dakota was like. And I similarly had no idea what it was like to grow up in South Central LA. And it was a huge learning experience that I still look back on to this day. I'm still in contact with him.
Yeah.
It was just a world-broadening thing for me, and learning what the world looked like from his point of view, and others who had that similar experience still to this day informs my perception of a lot of the stuff my clients have gone through.
Sure. So you're throw out the shingle. You have this skill set that you've developed over the past, 5 to 10 years.
So back to the anecdote you're referring to. So as a public defender and a young criminal defense lawyer, I quickly picked up on how many veterans were coming through the criminal courts. And they were mostly Vietnam veterans at that time in the late 90s. And many of them, I came to realize, had been cycling through the justice system on a regular basis ever since they'd come home from Vietnam. And I remember thinking, well, I had a bumpy go of it coming back from my service, and I didn't even see direct combat. So I can only guess, how impacted they were by this. And it was just intuitive. It just felt obvious. But then, one day I got one of the outlets that I found to keep myself out of trouble for my need for adventure and excitement was I took up sea kayaking up on Lake Superior in the 90s, and as I was getting out of law school, and got pretty heavily into it. And I was on a trip up in the Apostle Islands, early spring, and this would have been, I think, in 2000. And it was one of those cold, miserable, rainy weekends that we went out. We got out to the first islands, and it was just miserable and cold and windy, and we decided to just bail out, and we paddled back in and ended up in Ashland at a used bookstore coffee shop there. And I was looking in the shelves and found a book by a guy named Dr. Jonathan Shea called Achilles in Vietnam. And Dr. Shea is a retired VA psychiatrist who has spent a career treating Vietnam veterans, and he was also a student of the classics. And he wrote this book that drew direct correlations between the characters in Homer's Iliad and all of the trauma and stuff that they experienced in the Trojan War to the Vietnam vets that he had been treating. And with this thesis that, although war has changed over 3,000 years dramatically, the experiences and the impacts on the individual warriors out fighting and dying hasn't changed really at all. And the trauma that his Vietnam veterans experienced is mirrored very much in these ancient texts. And I stood in the bookstore, and I don't think I moved from that spot for a couple hours. I probably read the first 2 or 3 chapters just standing there transfixed. And it was just all of this stuff was rushing through my mind. And epiphanies going off all over the place, and I wandered over and bought the book and bought more coffee and sat there and read most of the book that day, just sitting there.
What were some of the early epiphanies that, if you can recall? I mean, I know it's hard to, now you've got all these connections, but what was hitting you then?
Just this what I was seeing with those Vietnam vets that I was working with in the courts. I'm just coming to realize this is age-old stuff. This has been every war that's ever been fought. There have been those who have brought their war home with them and have struggled with life thereafter, and that it just all was sort of gelling here. And I was thinking about the Vietnam vets that I had personally worked with and the stories I had learned from them, and it was just all clicked, like everything kind of snapped into focus, you know.
Yeah.
And then of course only a year or so later 9/11 happened, and we were off to yet another new war.
At that point, had you, I know you read a lot, right? And I know you've, in 1990, a Minneapolis native, Tim O'Brien, wrote a wonderful, famous book called The Things They Carried. Had you been in contact with that already?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I read a lot, and I've read a lot of military-related books over time, both fiction and nonfiction, and Tim O'Brien's book was definitely one of the more profound books that I'd come across. Yeah.
I remember I have a quote written up here, and so it's, they carried all they could bear, and then some, including a silent awe for the terrible power of the things they carried.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about how combat contributes to crime and how soldiers come home different.
The infliction of violence on other people profoundly changes people. And even the preparation and the psychological conditioning that it takes to prepare normal young people to do those terrible things has profound impacts on them, even if they don't ever do them, I think. But particularly if they do.
Yeah.
And it's dehumanizing, and it changes one's perception of who they are, and how they fit into society or don't fit into society when they come back. And I've had countless conversations about this over the years with all of my veteran clients, but one that always stands out to me in this context is a guy flashing forward a decade, into my practice, a young guy who had come back he had done 3 combat deployments in Iraq as a Marine, first machine gunner and then ultimately a sniper. And he was so young looking still. He was in his mid-20s, I guess, at this time that I was representing him. And he had kind of an Opie Taylor sort of, ginger, freckled redhead guy. But he looked like he could have been 16 years old still, except his eyes were like an old man. And he had come home and within a year had racked up 3 DWIs and was facing mounting punishments. So I had the conversation with him that I have with many of my all my veteran clients that come in, is that, there's no shame in having been impacted by your service. Veterans throughout the ages have come back and struggled with these things. There's no shame in getting help. If you go get some help that I'm going to help you get connected with, I think we can hopefully convince the prosecutor to not use the most blunt instruments of the justice system on you. And of course, this was back before veterans courts and any things like that. This is all just persuading judges and prosecutors to do something different. But he heard me out, and he just he didn't seem too engaged with the pitch I was giving him. And he politely sat there and listened, but he just had this distant look in his eye. And I kind of tapered off, and I just said, I'm talking a lot, and I'm not sure if any of this is landing. Tell me what you're thinking about. And he said, well, sir, I will. I'll go get help. I'll do what you're talking about. It makes sense. But he said, I've killed more people than any serial killer I've ever heard about, and I don't know if I'm ever going to be normal again.
Yeah, because we think about trauma, at least I have, I shouldn't impose it upon everybody, about the trauma that happens to people. But here, this is somebody that our government has put him in a position and asked him to do acts, and his own actions has caused this trauma, which is, it's for somebody not in there that's not experienced with it. It's to deal with that. On my side, there's so much blame and hurt and other things that come up with that it's hard to get to, hard to understand. I imagine that's a huge part of the work that you're doing, is to get those people that haven't been there to understand that.
They don't know what they don't know. And when you're dealing with prosecutors and judges, especially those who've done the job for a long time, they really think they do know it all, and they've seen it all. And in fact, I had another very pivotal conversation in my career related to that same case, that same client. Find myself not long after having that conversation with that veteran arguing with the prosecutor in the case. And again, this was a DWI. This wasn't a murder case. He hadn't done anything violent yet. But a third DWI in Minnesota carries a mandatory jail term and all of this. And I'm arguing, give him a chance to get some help. Let's stay the jail time and see how he does. And she wasn't buying it. And I started talking about all the stuff he had been through, 3 combat tours. It was an incredible amount of direct combat, fought in some of the more intense battles in Iraq, lost tons of friends, lots of things. And he was struggling, and I could see he was in a downward spiral, and he was heading to much darker things than just DWIs. And she cuts me off as I'm trying to convey all of this to her, and she just says, yeah, everybody has a sad story to tell. Oh. And that made me angry. And she then goes on to say, your client is dangerous and he needs to go to jail for 90 days. Like, that's going to solve all of this, right? And I kind of snapped, and I without really thinking too deeply about it, I said, with all due respect, I don't think you have any idea how dangerous my client is. And then I was like, oh, yeah, maybe not the best thing for a criminal defense lawyer to say about their client, right?
Yeah. But
in hindsight, it was exactly the thing to say, and I've said it in various forms countless times since then, because it's true. And in this particular context, these are folks who absolutely are outsized risk to public safety if they're not doing well, because the government has trained them to use lethal violence in a way that regular civilians are never exposed to.
And have no concept of.
And that's not to say all veterans coming home are dangerous. Most come back and are managing their military service experience and are wiser and stronger, faster, smarter, and immediate assets to their communities. But for those who are coming home and bringing that war home with them and are struggling with that and struggling with untreated trauma and often self-medicating with alcohol and drugs, they are absolutely outsized risk to public safety. And it's one of the imperatives beyond just doing the right thing for the veterans who've served and sacrificed on our behalf that I think drives this, is there's a public safety imperative to this. And not just a moral one, but just a pragmatic one. That we need to take advantage of the crisis presented by a veteran falling into the justice system and see that crisis as an opportunity to get them help that prevents them from continuing to offend and potentially offend in much more serious ways against their community.
So there's a lot there I want to unpack. The whole idea of 90 days that's going to protect our community. Tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, this idea that short-term incarceration modifies behavior.
It just doesn't tend to make people better. And for a veteran who's already struggling with significant trauma, to throw them in a cage and back into what they often rightfully perceive as a hostile environment is actually counterproductive.
Sure.
It's putting them back into a combat zone from their perspective.
Yep.
And very often they come out worse off than they went in and heading in a worse direction than they were before.
And why do you, maybe you already answered it, but why that happens is it just seems like it's more isolation, it's more alienation, it's more you don't belong.
And danger, there is the possibility of violence when you're incarcerated from other inmates, and
then you just spiral because now you're in an intense situation where you don't feel safe.
Back in a hostile environment.
And then it just goes from there.
Right.
As opposed to, you talk about what's the science, what's the research behind therapeutic interventions in helping public safety, as opposed to incapacitation or incarceration, putting somebody in a cage.
It's to address the underlying issues that are driving the criminal behavior. When there's an identified mental health or substance abuse issue that we can say this is what's the driving factor, it makes more sense to address those underlying issues in a fundamental way than to just punish the symptoms that come out of it. There's also a philosophical aspect to it that I've come to recognize, that veterans, and I think anybody who is ultimately sent off to jail, is a sense of abandonment, of being discarded by society and thrown away. And that hits particularly hard for veterans who've just risked their lives for that very society who they now see as turning its back on them and abandoning them. And it adds to that gulf between them and the society and their communities, and leads to greater levels of cynicism and hopelessness that they're ever going to really reintegrate.
Yeah. And maybe this is tied to what you're saying as well. We as a community I didn't vote for war, but I'm a part of a community that has sent somebody out for war. Somebody else is out there doing it. No sacrifice on my part, no real service at my part. What moral duty? I mean, do you think we as a community, we as a society have some sort of moral duty to those that we send out to do our dirty work?
We absolutely have one as a society, and I think it's even more profound in the criminal justice system. When a veteran comes home and brings that war home with them in all too predictable ways and falls into the justice system, they're now standing in judgment from the very government that sent them off to fight and who elected to start the war and deploy them. And there's actually scholarship on this, a law review article that we cite in our book, and I frequently bring up. I believe the author is Young-Hoo Lee, writes this very philosophically based law review article that basically makes the argument that the government lacks full legal standing in prosecuting combat veterans for crimes committed as a result of their service-related conditions, and not all legal standing, but that legal standing is impacted by the government's own involvement in creating the problem that is now, at issue in the criminal court. And we've made that argument to prosecutors and judges, and ultimately to legislators. We'll get to that later, that in standing in judgment of this veteran, and I'll say this to the prosecutor or the judge, you, prosecutor or judge, may not have been the one to start that war or to deploy this veteran off to it, but in prosecuting them or judging them in this case, you represent the government that did. And you have to take that into account in the way that you look at how to deal with this case.
If you're going to speak for or literally represent that entity, which is in this case the government, I think for your sentence, for your judgment to be accepted, there has to be an acknowledgement of that truth.
Right.
One of the articles that you wrote, and I read, you quote from a veteran, George Hill, that talks about PTSD. Do you remember that quote?
Yeah. PTSD is a name drained of poetry and blame. He says, and he preferred the Civil War term for what we call post-traumatic stress now was soldier's heart.
Okay.
An irritable heart. And in his quote, he says, that term connotates a disorder of warriors, not men who were weak or cowardly, but who at a young age put their feelings aside and performed unimaginable tasks.
And in that quote where he says it's, drained of poetry and blame,
Yeah.
the blame is outward as well. I think that's what we're talking about here, right?
Yeah.
The blame is not just to the person who is now suffering from the PTSD. I have some blame in that.
This is the whole society that sent them.
Yeah.
And the whole society that benefited from their sacrifices.
Yeah. Do you find those audiences, the representatives of the government, to be receptive of that, of accepting some of that accountability?
They don't tend to take it well in the moment.
Okay.
Because it's pretty provocative,
Yeah.
right? But I do think it lands ultimately, and I do think it has the desired effect.
Yeah. I was telling you before we started recording this morning, I had the wonderful opportunity to listen to a podcast by an attorney I deeply admire, Brian Stevenson. He wrote the book Just Mercy, his memoir, and he's been in front of the United States Supreme Court. He's doing all this wonderful advocacy, but he's this morning, and when I heard it this morning on Fresh Air, he said, when you tell the truth about the harm, then you think differently about the remedy. And there was something about that quote that reminded me of George Hill.
Yeah.
We have poetry and blame in his, and we have truth and harm with Brian Stevenson. And you need all of that to get to the remedy. That's essentially what you're saying with veterans?
100%. Yeah. We have to be honest with ourselves about why the veterans who are falling into the system are falling into the system, and the role that our society played in it, in order to find our way to the solution. And ultimately that solution is to help our troubled warriors heal from the injuries they suffered on our behalf, and to embrace them and bring them back into the communities they served.
Yeah. So you're back in that bookstore,
Yeah.
right? You're reading Achilles in Vietnam by Dr. Shea.
Yeah.
That's a springboard for all of the work that you've been doing. Can you take us on to that? What are the steps that you go from there?
Well, the next big one was 9/11/2001, right? And everybody remembers where they were that day. And I was in my apartment in Minneapolis getting ready to go to court when I turned on the TV and saw the first tower burning, watched the second tower hit, was just leaving for court as they started to fall. Went to court that day in St. Paul. It was interesting. There were 6 judges from Russia visiting the St. Paul criminal courts that day, which is very surreal. Never saw it before or since, but they were obviously tripping. Everybody was. And then that afternoon, I got together with my friend Jack Rice, who had served in the CIA and who was also a criminal defense attorney at that time. And we were officing together and all that. And we were having drinks and trying to process what had happened. And we had a lot of broad-ranging conversation that day. But one of the things I remember clearly saying is, we're about to go to war like we haven't since Vietnam. And we're about to deploy a whole bunch of folks over there to fight and sacrifice in a way we haven't seen in decades. And it's probably not going to be long before we start seeing them coming back with post-traumatic stress issues and landing in the criminal court system. And who knew at that moment what we were about to embark on, and how long it was going to go, and how deeply it was going to impact our country. And my life and my career, for that matter. But that was one of those points of realization of what was to come, I guess. And it wasn't long after. My first veteran client of the global war on terror, as it would come to be called, was a Green Beret who was part of the initial invasion of Afghanistan and returned home he and his wife had grown up in Minnesota, and she had returned to Minnesota while he was deployed, and he came back and found that she had been unfaithful to him. Classic Homer, the Odyssey kind of thing, and he committed an act of domestic violence against her that landed him in the criminal courts in Washington County, right across the river, and so he was the first of what would become many, many, many veterans of that war who would be coming back in the years ahead, and having a profound impact on my whole life and career path. Yeah.
How does it come to be that so many of them find their way to your office? Is that just organically?
Yeah. Initially, there wasn't a lot of people doing this kind of thing, and within the veterans community, word got out, and so they were showing up, and I had already been working with Vietnam vets and stuff, and so it just was word of mouth, and It was a slow trickle that grew into a flow, and then a deluge as the wars, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, built steam.
And then you're the editor, along with Brian Elsey, of Defending Veterans in Criminal Court. When did that come about?
A decade or so into that journey.
Okay.
We had really started, as the war in Iraq reached a crescendo in 06, 07, 08. We were just seeing a huge flow of veterans coming home and fresh off the battlefield. And Ryan came towards the latter part of that decade, in like 2009 is when I think he first popped up into my life. He was a law student at the time he's a decade younger than me, and so he was part of that generation, and he had deployed and had come back and was struggling, and ultimately went to law school and saw me do a presentation about this stuff and volunteered a summer and never left. But I had gotten involved. I was involved in the Minnesota Criminal Defense Attorneys Association and was the legislative chair during that interim. And in 2007, we decided to follow California's lead in passing our first veteran sentencing statute in Minnesota. Pretty humble statute. It really didn't do much by the time the prosecutors got done stripping all the good stuff out at the legislature. But in 2009, the following year, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down Porter v. McCullum, the first and only time they've addressed combat trauma in criminal sentencing. And they overturned the death penalty of a Korean War veteran because his defense attorney at trial had failed to bring any of his military service experience into either the trial or the sentencing phase. And in the heart of their opinion, they cited to Minnesota and California's recently passed sentencing statutes. And so that triggered a lot of things. And this advocacy that we had been doing kind of informally at that time started to become more formalized because we were getting contacted by people around the country interested in similar legislation, and started traveling and speaking and stuff around the country more and more. And then in 2010, we were contacted by an organization called the National Veterans Foundation that had put out a book a generation before for criminal defense lawyers on how to defend Vietnam veterans.
Okay.
And we had that book on our shelf along with others, with Dr. Shea's books and everybody. And here was the folks who put out that book asking us if we would do an updated version of it. And we had no idea what we were about to get ourselves into. And if we had, we probably wouldn't have done it, but it ended up being a 4-year all-consuming project. And what was going to be a 200-page book grew to a 700-page tome in which we made contact and relationships with some of the top experts in the field of veterans and the criminal justice system around the country, including Dr. Shea.
Yeah. You got to meet him?
Oh, yeah. That was so cool. And many others of our heroes from the books on our shelves that we convinced to contribute chapters from their kind of particular areas of expertise. And then we wrote several chapters ourselves and put this thing together. But it became like this all-consuming thing to channel all of this information that we had accumulated and distill it into something that we could give to attorneys to help veterans. Because we were realizing represent them all.
Yeah. Well, it's on my shelf there behind you. It's well worn and marked up, and it's definitely very thankful to have it to help some of my clients who are veterans. So thank you. Thank you. So I want to talk a little bit about this generation of veterans. Obviously, we've had veterans, throughout the history of time since the Iliad, but this current generation of American veterans, tell me about them.
They are incredibly unique in our history. And I would say in the history of most countries, this has become our longest serving generation of combat veterans. They fought our 2 longest wars in American history simultaneously. They fought it without our nation never had a draft in these conflicts. And so our militaries have been relatively small, given the scale of these conflicts, and we've sustained them by redeploying the same troops back again and again in a way we simply never did before. Vast majority of Vietnam veterans, as I often point out, and the numbers are hazy, but probably 90% served 1 tour in Vietnam. A few went back for a second or third time, but they were a relatively small minority. You contrast that to today. The veterans of the GWAT, as we call it, 2 and 3 tours are the norm. More than half the force deployed 2 or more times.
Wow.
And we have many veterans who've served many more than that. Our current record in our practice is somebody who did 13 combat deployments. We have another who did 12, and several more right behind them. And they're always, those who've deployed that much are always the most humble in my experience, and are quick to point out that they're nothing special in that regard. That in the special operations world where they came from, they have friends still serving that are now up over 20 combat deployments post 9/11. And the accumulated level of trauma that those folks are bringing home with them is hard to wrap your head around.
And if you can contrast their service and sacrifice in a war which we don't have a draft compared to Americans' service and sacrifice, how would you tell us about that?
That's part of the divide, right, between us and them, that concerns me, greatly. There's this divide between, I think, all generations of war veterans and the communities that they served, but this one, it's particularly stark. And the veterans who I work with in my practice on a regular basis, we see this very clearly with them, that they've come home, they brought their war home with them, they're not reintegrating back in, they feel that gulf very, very strongly. And well, the American public is not hostile towards them the way they were after the Vietnam War. You're not seeing veterans of these conflicts getting spit on and called baby killers like Vietnam veterans were famously treated. They're nonetheless othered, and it's more that they're invisible, that no one knows, no one cares, and no one's really paying attention to what they saw and did and experienced on our behalf. And there's a piece of graffiti from the Iraq War that I often cite in this regard, that was painted by some anonymous Marine on a concrete blast wall in Ramadi, Iraq, at the height of the violence there. And it said, the U.S. is not at war, or America is not at war. The U.S. Marine Corps is at war. America is at the mall. And that is a sentiment that I have heard countless times from veterans in one way or another, that they have a chip on their shoulder because we sent them over to do these things on our behalf, and we don't really have any sense of what we've asked them to do, and we're not paying attention. And we're at the mall.
One of my favorite songs is by the Lumineers, and there's a great line in there that says, "The opposite of love is indifference." And that's what it sounds like we're talking about here, is they're invisible, we're indifferent to them, and that in many ways is maybe more hurtful than hate.
I think so. Yeah. And then when that veteran acts out and lands in the justice system, that gulf grows further, and many of them feel as if they've already been abandoned by the government and sent into the war, abandoned by the society that they returned to, and now they're about to be judged by that same country and society and discarded. That's that's what they're bracing for. And
they get into warrior mode.
They're in warrior mode, and they're just ready to, get dumped on and discarded. And if the justice system then goes forward and does, as the justice system all too often does, and it does discard them, that gulf is often unbreachable or unbridgeable.
Sure.
So we've got this crisis that then presents an opportunity that if you can say, what if we don't discard you? What if we recognize your service and sacrifice on our behalf? And what if we give you a path to redemption that requires you to take some full accountability of yourself, not just some, to own your stuff, but go and get the help for it that we can line up for you. We'll give you a path to redemption. I've often come to see this as if we're dealing with veterans who come home and brought their war home with them and gone to war against their communities, and we're trying to broker peace treaties with them one at a time.
Yeah.
Lay down your arms, and we will give you a path back into the fold.
But you use the term accountability. And
Yeah.
I imagine you use that term accountability very different than the prosecutor across the table who wants 90 days in jail.
Right.
Tell me about what accountability means in your world, not just pure punishment.
Accountability is a veteran taking responsibility and recognizing they have agency over their actions, and that they are making choices that are contributing to the problems they're in, and that they need to take responsibility for that part of it, and recognize that they're not a victim 100% in this. They're impacted, but they have a role to play in this, and this isn't just about them sitting back while everybody else does the work.
Sure.
They've got to do the work.
And that's part of it, is right? I mean, accountability means they have to do the work.
Yeah.
And if they're sitting in a cage,
Yep.
they can't do the work.
Yeah. And, one of the analogies I frequently use with clients who are down in a deep, dark hole in life is to say, I can't carry you back up out of the hole you're in, but I can walk alongside with you and help light the path up out of this hole. But you're going to have to shoulder the rucksack and carry it up and get yourself out of this. And I'll walk shoulder to shoulder with you, but you're going to have to be doing the work. Only you can do the work ultimately.
Yeah.
And the work in this context is important to understand. There's lots of trauma therapies out there, and we have become better and better at it in the last 20 years of these wars at figuring out what works. There isn't one approach for every veteran, but there generally is an approach that will, some approach that will work for nearly everyone. But all of it requires a lot of work and trauma. It involves stabilizing the patient, but then having them start to process these unprocessed traumatic memories in the form of, talking about them and processing this unprocessed data. And that process is traumatic. And if left to their own devices, they would rather sit in their basement and drink Jack Daniels
It's hard work
to confront these terrible experiences that they went through. But, and this is a quick aside, the best way to think about this that I've ever heard came from a VA psychologist who was a Vietnam veteran. And he said, the way I think about it and I tell my patients about it is that the brain is a computer. It's an organic computer. And he said, when you get somebody who's experienced severe trauma, it's like they've had a massive input of data that is too much for their processor to manage. It overrides their RAM. The motherboard seizes up, and all that unprocessed traumatic data goes onto an auxiliary hard drive. And then it keeps rebooting back up to the motherboard over and over and over again, trying to process these unprocessed data. But it keeps doing it in these huge chunks that continue to override the system. And that is the intrusive memories, and that's the PTSD that will persist forever unless or until addressed. And the way to address it in this analogy is that we stabilize the system, and then we bring up discrete packets of that unprocessed data to process it a little bit at a time, and take that data and put it on the shelf with all the rest of the data on the main hard drive of life experiences until there isn't anything left that keeps rebooting. And that makes so much sense to me once I started to realize that. But it's hard. It's heavy lifting. And ideally, you need to incentivize veterans to be willing to do it. If they're faced with just going to do this trauma therapy or going to sit in a cage for 90 days, many will choose the cage.
In some ways, it's easier.
It's easier. And so that's where the advocacy comes in, that if we're going to do this and do a therapeutic intervention, there needs to be a carrot, not just a stick. There needs to be an incentive, and that incentive takes the form of an opportunity to avoid a criminal conviction, if possible. And in more serious offenses where it's not, to avoid the prison or jail time that would be attached. But to maximally, to the extent possible, incentivize that veteran to walk this road.
Yeah.
And to have a goal at the end of that road that's worthwhile, and that is to rejoin the community and be an asset to the community and not just an ongoing liability. But as we often point out, a criminal conviction in the 21st century is the modern day scarlet letter that will follow you around and make it even more impossible to ever reintegrate back into that community.
It's more alienation, more isolation, less
permanent second-class citizenship.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
So that's the advocacy that we've done on a case-by-case basis over the years, that's gotten into the legislation that we've worked to pass. The Veterans Treatment Courts that we can talk about separately generally offer some level of legal incentive for the veterans to participate.
Yeah. If you're enjoying this episode so far and you want to learn more, check out Brock's book, The Attorney's Guide to Defending Veterans in Criminal Court. It's a step-by-step guide to better defending veterans. It starts with general information about combat, discusses moral injury and PTSD, how to approach the attorney-client relationship, and includes specific legal strategies for defending veterans in every point of a case. This book helped me divert 2 of my clients from prison to mental health treatment. It gave me the courage to ask those in power to do more than merely say, "Thank you for your service," and the confidence to challenge them to accept their moral duty to take care of our veterans who work to protect us. I highly recommend. Go check it out. There was a painting that I'd heard you talk about, law versus mob rule. Can you tell us a little bit about that painting? Do you remember that painting?
Oh, yeah, very much. And and when I first saw the title of your podcast, Sanctuary in the Jungle, and understood the reference, that's the first thing that jumped to my mind, is that painting. And when I first encountered that painting, it was just across the river in the old Stillwater courthouse. I came to learn the original is a mural on a wall at a big court building in Washington, D.C., and it's a Depression-era painting that depicts a judge standing on the courthouse steps with a beaten and weary person who's crawled up on the courthouse steps seeking refuge from a lynch mob. And the judge is standing out there shielding this person from the mob and raising a hand and sort of holding them at bay. Yeah. I think it just perfectly symbolizes this concept of sanctuary in the jungle that the criminal justice system provides us. And more poignantly, the criminally accused from the mob, from the jungle.
And oftentimes we as criminal defense attorneys like to think of ourselves as the person standing at the gate, but maybe if it's run perfectly, the judges are at the door. The judges are at the gate, right?
And the prosecutor, for that matter, if they're really doing their job right.
Yeah. You helped to do some legislation in 2021.
Yeah.
And tell us about that, and tell us how you structured it in a way that talked about this role, this special role that judges can play, both against the mob, but in your legislation.
Yeah. So the 2021 legislation we passed in Minnesota is called the Veterans Restorative Justice Act, and it's basically version 2.0 of our original legislation. And this time we came in a much more organized, and we were able to keep all the cool stuff in that got stripped out the first time around. And in the intervening years, we had the advent of the Veterans Court movement that sprung up right around that 2009 timeframe in Buffalo, New York, and spread across the country. And we jumped on that bandwagon very quickly. And Ryan and I worked with folks in the Minnesota courts to set up the first Veterans Court in Hennepin County in 2009 and 10, and helped set up many more in the years since. But in that decade of veterans courts evolving, both in Minnesota and across the country, the tradition in the veterans courts is the prosecutor is the gatekeeper for who gets into the veterans court. And we found over time that created a lot of problems and disparities, because the prosecutor's standards by which somebody could get into their court vary dramatically from court to court and even prosecutor to prosecutor within a single jurisdiction.
Sure.
And it varied over time. There might be a county attorney who was really on board with this, and then they retire or don't get reelected, and a new one comes in, and it's you got to start all over again.
So if everybody in the old world, if the veteran was on board for it,
Yeah.
the judge was on board for it, in many ways, the prosecutor could just veto it and say, nope.
And they regularly would. And they would also vary dramatically in what kind of legal incentive they were willing to offer. In the better situations and the better courts, in our perspective, the prosecutors were more open in allowing veterans with more serious offenses into the court, and were also more willing to give them significant legal breaks as part of the process if the veteran did everything asked of them. But it was not uniform, to say the least, and there were prosecutors who were extremely selective in who they would let in, often cherry-picking very low-level cases, veterans who really were not doing that badly, and there were prosecutors who would still convict them of their crimes even if they did everything asked. So there was very little legal incentive there. And those courts, we found, often struggled to find enough veterans because they just weren't providing enough of a carrot to even make it worth their while to go do that tough therapy and accountability we talked about. And this wasn't just Minnesota, this was across the country. Every state that has veterans courts sees these same disparities from court to court, and there are also the majority of jurisdictions who never got a veterans court. And so the type of opportunity for justice that veterans getting were dramatically different depending on where they happen to commit their offense. And so in 2017 in Minnesota, this crisis really reached a crescendo because the state public defenders, frustrated with all of these dynamics, pulled their public defenders out of the existing veterans courts. There was a funding crunch, and the state public defender just is like, we've got other things that we can focus our limited resources on, and unless or until the courts start to, address these issues, we're just going to take our ball and go home. And this was a huge crisis for Ryan and I in the Veterans Defense Project, because our vision was some form of veterans court opportunity in every jurisdiction in Minnesota and across the country. And this was a big, big setback. So we went to the legislature and sought and received a grant, and spent the next couple of years putting together and helping run a working group of key stakeholders, key county attorneys and judges and other folks from the justice system and the VA, to figure out how we could do better by Minnesota veterans. And in doing so, we decided an updated statute was the best vehicle to do it. And key in that was to set up a sentencing mechanism that would apply in every jurisdiction, whether they had a vet court or not. It would put the decision-making power in the hands of the judge, not the prosecutor, and it would set up a process that a veteran would go through for a judge to consider whether they would be eligible here.
And when you say decision, sorry to interrupt, but when you say decision-making process, obviously most people think judges have decision-making process all the time. How is it different? Tell us in the particular, how is it different here in this statute?
Well, in Minnesota, judges do not, with very few exceptions, have the ability to grant a stayed conviction, for instance, unless the prosecutor's on board with it. So they can't give that veteran the opportunity to avoid a criminal conviction. So this statute provides a due process that a veteran can say, I think I have been impacted by my service. I think it played a role in my offense, and the burden is on the veteran and their attorney to bring forth the evidence to support this prospect. The prosecutor has an opportunity to object, and there's even a mechanism for a contested hearing as to whether or not the veteran meets the criteria. But ultimately, the judge is the decider. And if the judge decides that the veteran meets the criteria, then the veteran is given an opportunity to take accountability, go get the help they need, and is offered some form of legal benefit.
It's like a sentencing hearing pre-charging almost.
Right, yeah.
Right?
Or certainly pre-plea.
Okay.
So this eligibility happens pre-plea. Ultimately, we introduced the bill. It took us a couple years to get everybody on board with it because it was a pretty dramatic departure from the status quo.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it really changes the roles within the judge now moves forward with taking away the discretion from the executive branch.
Yep.
It's also, I think for those that don't necessarily work every day in the law, it's remarkable. And it's also remarkable the fact that the simplicity of it is basically, we're going to give the judge the power to consider this person's life in making decisions about this person's life.
Yeah. Right.
Right? I mean, right now in Wisconsin, I have a case that's maybe going to go to in front of the Supreme Court, but I represent somebody who's accused of doing something when they were 10. And the Court of Appeals just said, yeah, you need to consider the fact that the person was 10. Let's treat kids like kids. And that's like a major change in the law.
Yeah.
Right? And that's some of the things that you're doing which if we think about the law, right? I mean, the fairness of it, sometimes it's obvious to you, it's obvious to me, but that's not the way the law is written. You have to go out and do the work. You have to do the grind. You have to get these committees. You have to convince these stakeholders. You have to get the people in power to do things that might be as simple as like, hey, let's give the person in charge some power to consider the humanity of the person they're in front of.
Yeah. And I've learned over the years that the legislative process, it's different in many ways than doing criminal defense work, but there are so many similarities too. And it's all about persuasion.
Yeah.
And it's just a different kind of jury, And I've had the immense fortune to marry a woman who that's what she does full time is legislative advocacy, my wife Sarah. And in fact, we met through doing criminal justice reform at the Minnesota legislature, and she spent most of her adult life doing criminal justice reform, and now works on election reform. But we're very kindred spirits, very overlapping skill sets, and I've learned a ton about taking the skills I learned in the courts and applying them in this different context.
Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic, Brock.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your coming in here and sharing all of this with us. One last question before we go is, this is difficult work. You're pounding your head up against the wall. You're trying to bridge different people that maybe don't want to listen. You're sometimes having to go into battle yourself, figuratively, metaphorically. What keeps getting you to show up? What fuels you? What's the motivation that says, hey, I've been doing this 27 years and I'm Monday, I'm going to be right back at it?
It's that sense of purpose and mission and meaning. I've come to realize that finding a sense of meaning in this career has been the key for me. I'm a meaning over money guy, probably to a fault. But it's what keeps me going. And along the way, and I think this is an important topic to discuss with folks that do this work, with veterans and non-veterans, is secondary trauma, right? And it's very real for all of us. We deal, with so many people who've been through so much trauma, and that's certainly the case in our practice, and something that I have come to learn you've got to manage. There was a time there where Ryan and I think just felt if we weren't working 120 hours a week, we were failing.
Yeah.
We're failing our clients, failing veterans, and then we just need to suck it up and keep up the mission. And that caught up with us, and we definitely both experienced kind of crash outs towards the tail end of finishing the book project and the height of all of the stuff happening at that time. And I had a really pivotal conversation with a therapist around that time at the VA, who gave me this analogy about secondary trauma. He said it's like you're starting out with an empty rucksack, and every piece of secondary trauma that you pick up from a client is like a little pebble.
Yeah.
And a few pebbles in the bottom of an empty rucksack doesn't weigh much. You don't notice it. But over the years, they keep accumulating, and you don't notice it because the weight is gradual and everything. But eventually, it's going to bring you down, And in this analogy,
the terrible power of the things that you carry.
Yeah. And the interesting, and the key to this analogy is that the way to solve it is you tear a little hole in the bottom of that rucksack that allows the pebbles to drain out of the bottom of it. And that comes from taking care of yourself. Get outside, go ride your bike, go enjoy life. You got to get rest. You got to take time away from the mission, or you will not be able to continue performing the mission, and you will fail your clients in the future, right? And that was a hard lesson to learn, and I think we both had to bottom out before we were prepared to listen to it. But the last decade of the work, I would say, has been much better in that regard for us in our lives. It made us actually more productive than that first decade, where we were really in the thick of it and not thinking in the big picture. And I always say that to fellow defense lawyers, is you've got to take care of yourselves before you can take care of your client. Yeah. And it's okay. You don't need to feel guilty about it, right?
Well, thanks for coming and sharing. I hope you've helped all of us to put a hole in our rucksack that's a little bigger, a little wider, to let things travel through. So I've greatly enjoyed it. Thanks again.
It's been an honor. Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Sanctuary in the Jungle. This episode was brought to you with the help of Made Daily and Nelson Defense Group. If you enjoyed the listen, share the episode with a friend, whether it's someone working in the system, someone who wants to learn more, or someone who's never thought about criminal defense before. My hope is that these conversations not only encourage you to care more about our legal system and the people in it, but also to share that energy with others, keeping the whole community moving forward. So carry the hope, share that hope with a friend, and we'll see you next time at the library.